introduce to all of you Dave Snowden. And though Dave, you are, you're a specialist, expert in knowledge management and the application of complexity science. And I think it's the best way we can end these 3 days of conference about structural change, talking about how complex is such a subject. Well, I will read the name of your presentation, the long one. In the poster, we had to kind of make it shorter, but it's using schools and other youth institutions as infrastructure for continuous real-time sensing. And here there will be links made with the basic work in the way attitudes map the perception of justice. Dave, you have the mic, and as I said also while introducing John, we are welcoming comments, questions in the chat, or by raising the hand, or just unmuting yourself and joining the conversation. Dave.
Okay, I'm not going to use any slides on the basis this is a short presentation. But I will put some links to the material in the box. What I'm going to talk about is actually about how do we create a structure which is based on what we call epistemic justice, i.e. the right of people to interpret their own experience. And that's kind of like a key point. We do a lot of work with narrative. Narrative is a primary explanatory material. Sharing narrative is one thing, but power comes with who interprets the narrative. And that's a really important thing to realize. The origins of this work actually come from DARPA programs. We were looking, when I was in IBM before I left and set up my own company, we were looking at how do you identify the weak signals which indicate a civilian population is going from tacit to explicit support of terrorism. And that is actually revealed in street stories, which is how we got into this stuff. Subsequently, bulk of our work has been development sector. And we're currently starting the initial experiments on a major program, and I'll give, which is quite ambitious, but I'll talk about that in a minute or two. So one origin on that is epistemic justice, the right to interpret your own story. The second, and this comes from complexity science, is in a complex adaptive system, you haven't got any linear material relationship between cause and effect. What you've actually got is a dispositional system. And one of the ways I often explain it, it's rather like you've got a sort of ring of magnets, some of which you control, some which are controlled by people you're aware of, and some of which you've got no idea whether they're subject to conscious control or not. And in the middle of those magnets, there are a whole series of, cast iron objects of varying sizes and density. So if all the magnets keep the same polarity and the same strength, I can predict what will happen. I get a stable pattern. If I change one of the magnets, I can predict what will happen. If I change two of the magnets, I can predict what will happen. If I change three of the magnets, I can no longer predict it. I may be able to model it, but that's different. Yeah, it's kind of like a variation on the three-body problem. And in complexity science, we talk about effectively systems as being modulated, not having causality. The magnets are in effect modulators. They're modulating the system, but they're interacting with each other. Now, if you think about that particular metaphor, if I actually can look down on the system in real time and I can control enough of the modulators, then I can actually manage the system patterns. But the critical thing is to understand the modulators, to have some control over those. But critically, it's that ability to see what's happening in real time, because you want to reinforce things very quickly if they're going in the right direction and disrupt them if they're not. The other key aspect of complexity science on this is that you don't change systems at a macro level, you change them at a micro level. In a complex adaptive system, you have lots and lots of actors with highly rich interactions between them. Yeah, if you can stimulate those or vary those, you can see patterns emerging, and then you can reinforce good ones and disrupt bad ones. because you haven't got linear material causality, it's actually quite dangerous to determine in advance what results you want, because you may actually miss out on different types of opportunities. So that real-time observation is key. So when we started this work, we knew that in terms of research, about the only technique which really gets close to understanding people's lived experience is ethnography. And we have a large amount of anthropologists within our circles. The trouble is that ethnography doesn't scale. It depends on deep immersion over long periods of time by experts. And those experts themselves actually come from different cultures or from different purposes. So I can't remember when we got the idea, but it worked. We suddenly thought, well, hang on a minute, why don't we make people ethnographers to their own condition? Because that also has the advantage that there will not be external cultural imposition. And in theory, we can do that at very large scale. And so that was what we started to work on. So I'll give you an example of a couple of projects and then sort of go back to where we want to go with this. So one of the first ones we did was in South Wales. This is where I come from. It's my own background. South Wales is a deeply depressed post-industrial environment. You've got in the valleys, you've got whole towns and streets where nobody's seen a job in 3 generations, with all of the consequences which come from that. So there's always a desire to sort of do something about it. So we got some Welsh government funding to take a different approach. So what we actually did is we used school children, and we also used youth from sports clubs as ethnographers into their own communities. You do this at sort of age 17, 18. You can also do it with young students. So the basic principle is people from their own community will go out and interview people in that community, will look for patterns, will discover patterns. One of the big plus points on this, by the way, is it actually ticks boxes for teachers in all school curriculums. I'll talk later about the work we're doing with the International Baccalaureate. There's a need to engage children in their community. There's a need to engage them in research. There's a need to engage them in understanding statistics, interpretation, politics, and ethics. So we can tick one big box with all of that. We also needed to make sure that we could make this quant, not qual. My background is a joint honours in physics and philosophy. And I'm afraid that gives me a physicist's contempt for social science on the basis they never have enough data to form any valid conclusion whatsoever. And if you really want to move something at scale, it needs to be quant, not qual. We also knew that you can't ask direct questions, because if you ask people direct questions, they gift or gain the response. So I'll give you a really simple example. You know, when we did a mass capture of 50,000 micro-narratives using young people in Pakistan, we were looking at attitudes to justice. We didn't ask them on Likert scales what they thought about justice. We asked them a very simple question about, give us an example which has happened in your community which caused you some distress or some pleasure. You can play games with this. We then asked them to interpret that onto a series of triangles, and there's a lot of cognitive neuroscience behind the use of triangles. I can go in if you want later. But one of the triangles said, in this story, justice is about restoration, punishment, prevention. Now, we didn't use that language. We used Low Urdu, but those were the concepts behind it. So what this is called high abstraction metadata, people effectively balance 3 positive or negative qualities. They're not shown a positive negative scale. And of course, with 6 triangles, I get 18 data points. And we do other stuff in the work we're doing on patient journeys and patient authorities in hospitals. We're actually, for example, looking at empathy against pain and people positioning markers on that about their perception and their perception of how medical staff see them. So the whole point is graphical gamification. Nobody knows what the right answer is, but to gather metadata at scale. So we did that. Kids get access that nobody else will get. They're authentic to the community. They're part of the community. They're not seen as external. And from that results, we actually do what's called a fitness landscape or a narrative topography. These things look like contour maps, where dense contours indicate very strong attitudes, weak contours indicate effectively weaker attitudes and so on. So we drew those maps, and then it's possible, in this case, a minister looked at those maps and said, well, I'd really like the balance to be more in this direction. So, and this is a new theory of change, by the way, they can click on the map and say, well, if I could have more stories like these and fewer stories like those, then I would fund it. So they're not talking about abstract values, they're talking about concrete stories from the environment in terms that anybody can understand, regardless of their level of education. So we took that as a ministerial directive. We then set up transgenerational pairs. So this is teenagers working with people from their grandparents' generation. And again, there are cognitive neurosciences reasons for making that pair choice relating to plasticity and innovation. And if any of them came up with a novel idea, they were put in a trio with somebody from government who could make the idea work for them. And one of the best projects came from a thing called Connor's Bike. Anybody who's Welsh and of my age group can remember exactly where they were when the Aberfan disaster hit it. For those of you who don't know it, it's when a coal mine slag heap was undermined by water and literally collapsed and killed an entire generation of children by submerging them in the school. So for my generation, those slag heaps are associated with the horror of Aberfan. But for younger people, because they're now all stabilized, they're planted, they're effectively hillside, they're seen as a missed opportunity. So one of these pairs came up with a bright idea of creating a bike park, a bike run over the slag heaps, starting and finishing in a local pub. The local authority person in the trio knew that the fire service wanted fire spotters. The community got together, they built the bike park, didn't cost anybody anything, and it all worked from the pub. Now, I think we thought was useful, but then when we looked at it to inform more detail, we found that the pub car park was where the drug dealers met. And the local community knew that, so effectively they did an intervention which prevented the drug guys from meeting there, the county gangs, Now, that was one of about 50 or 60 small initiatives generated bottom up, rather than some grand government plan based on improving things in 2 years, based on some universal principle. And it also generated context-specific experiments within a local area. Now, we're currently extending that, by the way, with some of the big banks to actually allocate money into those groups without the need for bureaucratic control. The other one we've done, which is published, is looking at refugees in Malmo, using young people in Malmo at scale over several years to gather stories from refugees, their impact on society, and then to look at patterns in that material and again do the more narratives like these, fewer narratives like those. So the vision on this and where we're going with it and where we're working on is the idea is to have literally every child in every school in the world as an ethnographer into their community in an open source database. And that actually handles some of the issues with the internet, because instead of worrying about algorithms to tell you what's true or false, we focus on getting the input right. But it also means that locals, governments, all levels are informed by the real stories of the people they're meant to serve. And we can identify small initiatives which can be made early. And when I was first looking for funding on some time ago, I remember saying, if we ever have a major pandemic, we need a system like this, because we need to measure people's attitudes to school district level to determine policy. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're now getting more traction on this. So I don't intend to speak for much longer. I just want to kind of like, there's a lot more science behind this. I can go into it if you want. It's actually covered in the European Union Field Guide on how to manage complexity in a crisis, of which I was the principal author. I've given you a link on that, and I've also given you a link to our citizen engagement brochure, because once we've built a network like this, we can use it to inform citizen assembly, citizen juries, and budgeting. But the fundamental principle comes back to 2 or 3 things. First of all, we think people need the power to interpret their own experience and to intervene at a micro level in their community, albeit with some direction, in order to achieve results. We need micro interventions which can be reinforced when they start to work and disrupted when they don't, rather than grand strategies and plans, because that will change the dispositional nature of the system. And I'll come back to it and I'll keep repeating it. The power issue is key. If you look at the criticism from anthropology, for example, of participative action research, and that applies to a lot of the government labs and stuff like that, the criticism is that it attracts the usual suspects. It attracts people who match the culture of the facilitators. And by the way, we're now approved for use in indigenous communities in Australia using these sort of techniques, because we don't impose a white structure onto their own stories or onto their own interventions. So to me, this ability to create distributed systems which connect people, which give people a right to interpret their own authentic experience, are absolutely vital. And we're looking for more people to participate in this. We're currently actually actively fundraising now to make this a worldwide program. At that point, I'll stop and open up for questions.
Dave, thank you so much. Yep, let's see. Any questions, comments? Please join the conversation.
Hi, I think it might be rather taken out of the context. Sorry, Dave. It's late in Europe now. I wonder how do you, like, because it's just a snapshot of what you do, how do you approach those communities with who you work? Because in my experience, it's especially if you are an outsider and not working within your country context where you have your other trusted networks, even if you have some ideas to suggest to people on the ground without those bigger power games involved, how do you connect to those? Like, do you have any kind of gatekeepers or any network? How do people get in touch with you to trust you to be able to work on something with them? Thank you.
Okay, so two answers to that. One is I've just put up a link to a publication which came out recently from Catholic Relief Service in Oxfam about the work they've done using the approach, yeah? And they're answering those sort of questions directly. We kind of agree and disagree with that work, all right? It's very heavily facilitated. It's based on gatekeepers and material like that, but they've got the ethics sorted out. We're trying a very different approach on that. So, for example, by creating packs that can be picked up and used by schools, the system is distributed automatically. We had a lot of success by creating packs for sports clubs, and this is a major agent for change in Africa and Asia, by which the coach and the players and the parents would want to use the software to understand how their sports club was doing, but then would also do ethnography on a local basis. So one of the principles is to give people a tool they find useful to something that matters to them, which then indirectly gives you the ability to have a human sensor network from which you can see patterns. So we're also trying to stop people becoming research subjects. Yeah? One of the most appalling experiences of my life actually was the first time I went to Kenya in the 70s. And we were taken on a sort of, white guy's tourist trail of slums in north of Nairobi, and wasn't it quaint, and couldn't we do something about that? And I'm still, still remember that, right? And it was like, we need to create the mechanism by which people in their own culture at their own level can actually find their own voice and can actually access funding without it being mediated by people from another culture. So our approach is to create things for schools, for sports clubs, for church groups, for theatre groups, which they actually want to use, but the price of their using it is they then become part of a sensor network. There's ethics around how you capture this, people can withhold their stories, etc. But then you start to ask them questions and give them effectively the ability to raise cash. I can give you some more examples on that if you want in a minute, so that they start to get autonomy in their own environments rather than be subject to somebody from outside.
Thank you so much. We have Gustavo with the question or comment. Please, Gustavo.
Hi, hello. It's good to see you all. it's amazing the work that you are doing, because for me it's just more a comment because of my context. I am from Guatemala, and and you can understand that we as a country don't have this kind of knowledge that is being produced by researchers. We, for example, we just have one public university, and this public university, it's not making enough efforts, for example, in order to get into to this kind of information that, for me, working in the human rights field is gold. Like the information that you can produce with the examples that you gave to us, because for me it's matter of children. Not much I can say, again, from my context and from the work that I've been doing for about 12 years right now, that not much money is invested from, for example, the international cooperation in order to get this kind of information, of this kind of efforts to understand better what the children think about their own context. And I can relate it that to when you go into a school, for example, middle school, and you ask them for their what they think about their human rights or the government, or the way in which they are living their lives, is very complicated, because their own educational system is not just enough, and is not the best. But sometimes I think in this kind of effort that you are like explaining to all of us during this presentation, and it's amazing. I totally agree with that. When you say about the pandemic, if we face another pandemic, this kind of information definitely is going to help us to understand better in which ways we want to face the things like that. And thank you.
Yeah, we did a lot of work with, I mean, we've done several projects now in Central America. Personally, I've been heavily involved in projects in Colombia, particularly looking at using children as ethnographers into the really poor areas to identify how entrepreneurs, if they succeed, will stay in the poor areas rather than actually leave. So we get that sort of urban regeneration. And I think it's at a micro level you can start to achieve that. One of the other big things, and I mentioned two things now, we can also use this in this whole bunch of stuff on peace and reconciliation. Back in the 70s, when I was working on that in Northern Ireland, we got fed up with everybody being pulled into big meeting rooms to talk about how they should be nice to each other, but it had no effect whatsoever. What we did is we took small groups of people from both communities, and I dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro, where I had contacts, and left them there for 6 months. And they suddenly discovered they had a lot more in common than they thought, and then they had a conversation about their differences, in their own time without facilitation, and that to me is important. One of the things we're now looking at is to identify stories, for example, and I'll give the States as the example because that's where we're having I'm out to Washington tomorrow from this. What we're looking at is to actually identify stories which are interpreted the same between people from right-wing and left-wing backgrounds at a micro level, and then actually have combined teams of young people from those two communities to work on those common problems. So they start to understand each other and start to get an empathetic link. And for me, this is, a lot of the work on how we handle misinformation. I mean, AI, coming back to the earlier subject, is now actually targeting people with personalized lies 10 minutes before they vote. I mean, that's the level of scariness we've got on. And you don't counter that by more algorithms, you counter it by creating empathetic relationships between people who see each other in conflict so that they're not prepared to believe the lies. So I think we see this stuff extending into other areas like that.
Thank you. Dave, a question to you. Do you consider, or did you already consider including like community centers and public libraries in this big project? If you remember, we had a conversation when we invited you for an event where we had librarians and also community foundations. So if we look around, we still have, I mean, around 500,000 community centers, like libraries, public libraries and community libraries all around the world, and it can be like
and I mean, you know, my view on this, and we've said all the time we're prepared to support that. We actually think libraries are a golden opportunity to actually act as a narrative center. And I think the key thing here, what we need material at scale. If we're going to handle things like global warming, like conflict, you've got to have material at scale, and it's got to be real time. You can't have lots of isolated research projects. So from our point of view, yes, all right, that's what's actually needed. The issue is for people the will to do something differently. And it's interesting, it's this psychological switch from saying we will research this subject and come up with the answer, to saying we will build a structure which can do research on the fly. Now, to me, that's self-evident, but I feel sometimes I'm knocking my head against a brick wall in universities and elsewhere. I think some of them actually like transcribing people's stories and tagging them, which to me sounds terminally boring, but also I think it's unethical. Yeah. I think the other thing, it raised the first talk when I came on. I've got to give a big lecture on AI in DC next week. And one of the points I'm trying to make is that all computer intelligence currently is inductive, whereas human beings are abductive. Yeah. And we know that the evolution of art, you know, particularly music and dance and painting, comes before language and human evolution, before substantial language development. We actually use abstraction for signification. We use pictures as well as text. And so that human capacity to see things through abstractions is a fundamental human intelligence. And my worry on the AI side is not that it will ever exceed us in intelligence, but we're planning to meet it halfway. And it's no coincidence several elite American schools are now banning computers in the classroom so that their children will have strategic advantage because they'll develop human skills. Now, I think narrative databases, narrative engagement, community engagement is one of the ways we make sure we keep those human skills intact at a scalable level, in terms of the way it works. And we do need young people. One of the unique things about Wales, well, there are many unique things about Wales, but one of them is we're the first country in the world to pass a Future Generations Act. Laws cannot be passed in Wales if they can be shown to contradict the needs of the future generations. And we've already banned 3 motorway extensions on that basis alone. We put legislative structure in place, which means that needs of young people actually have to impose themselves on the legislative framework. So what we're also building here is the need to allow those young people to interpret their own communities into government.
Maybe you can add some resources on that in the chat. That would be really helpful, and it's interesting. So thank you so much. If we have some more questions or comments from the participants, please, John.
Yeah, I can't figure out how to actually do the little hand raise, so I'm just going to raise my hand. Dave, sort of building on what, sort of riffing off of what Mihai just said with the community centers, how do you actually capture those stories then? So, and then sort of measure them and sort of make use of that data. And also when you're using kids as ethnographers, how do you capture stories and put it into a format where you can then sort of analyze that data? Okay, so let me sort of take you through a couple of examples, all right? And great. I'll give you a medical one actually, because it's an easy one to explain everything on. So we've just completed a project with the Dutch government on residential care homes. Yeah. And what we've done there is we've had continuous narrative capture from medical staff, residents, and relatives, including young people.
And it was originally designed to create narrative to support the medical systems, but actually it's flipped. It's now the other way around. The narrative actually has more utility. So the way it works, if I'm a nurse, all right, for example, I can record a patient story, I can take a picture of the patient, I can write notes. All of that we call a micronarrative. And then presented with a series of graphical shapes on which I place markers. Yeah. So actually, the interpretation is done at the point of capture, which is why it costs no more to capture 500 items than it does one item. Yeah. So that gives me numbers. So what I've got numbers linked to stories. Yeah. Now we've then got standard ways that we do that, but we can also export those numbers into R or anything else you want, and you can do whatever statistical analysis you want. So think of it rather like longitudinal research, where somebody captures data, writes it down, tags it with the theory of the field in mind. We take the theory of the field, but we build it into the triangles, and people self-tag their own material, but we also allow them to use voice and pictures. Yeah, because actually that really matters in most languages, and it allows, and we can capture in any language, because you only read the stories if you need an explanation for the statistical patterns. Right? And that's an important principle on this sort of work, right? So it's the primary interpretation is done by the storyteller. Yeah, that creates statistical data which can then be used for research purposes. But when we did one of the ones I'm proudest of, actually, we looked at genital mutilation in Africa. So we used young girls as ethnographers into their own communities on that. They were then able to sit down with the material as they captured it with people in their village and say, how can we create more stories like this and fewer stories like that? And then create micro interventions and put them into the same system. Yeah. Now, what was fascinating on that is we then took clusters of stories interpreted the same way by people in Africa. And then we gave them to people in the development communities in Washington and asked them to interpret them the way they thought the girls in Africa had interpreted them. Right? And of course, it was radically different. Now, there are three answers to that one, two of which are legitimate. The right answer is they see it like this, we see it like that. What does that mean for policy? Yeah. The bad one is we should see it like they see it. Well, you can't. You'd have to go to Africa, live in the environment, suffer in the horrendous operation. Then you might see it the way they do. So you can't. The worst of all, which we actually had with anthropologists in Vienna when we did a Roma project, and we contrasted Roma stories with their own interpretation. They said, oh, we're the experts. They don't understand their own stories. I've never forgotten that one. Yeah. But that process of saying, here's some material, and we did this with the EU on the Ponte project, present a story, people find a story they find attractive, they index it, then they're shown how the originator indexed it, and that's why it's different. And we first did that in Liverpool Slavery Museum, and we see that as a key way of getting people to see things from different perspectives at a micro level. And I say this very strongly, without the facilitation of white Anglo-Saxon Protestants from Boston who think they know how the world should be arranged. Sorry, that's a particular bugbear of mine at the moment, all right? Dealing with Boston Brahmins, all right? What we want is self-facilitation, self-interpretation, but total transparency and visibility so that good ideas can spread horizontally, not just mediated through agencies.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Do we have any questions? Any other questions or comments? Dave, question. I mean, if anyone of the participants would want to, I don't know, invite you to, events or to ask more questions, where can they find you?
I'm fairly easy to find, particularly on social media, which is a hobby. That's my email address, And I say we're actively looking now to put together a consortium to get some serious money and to do this properly worldwide. So if anybody's interested in that, please get in touch.
Excellent. Thank you so much. With this, I want to close the session, the third session today, but then not the whole conference. For this, I'm handing the microphone to you, Thomas.
Okay, not much more to say. I thought this was a fantastically interesting session and a wonderful, worthy conclusion to the conference. And even though you weren't all at all sessions, I hope you enjoyed and learned a lot from the proceedings. And I think we have a much better sense of structural change, what it is, how to achieve it, what to aim for, how to prioritize, how to mobilize, and so on, than we had when we set out 3 days ago, or maybe a few months ago when we started planning this event. So thank you all, everybody in the session, moderators, speakers, and thank you all for participating in the conference. And see you all in a year.